CIA Headquarters, Langley, Virginia, March 15, 1967. Robert Henderson squinted at the grainy black and white satellite photograph spread across his light table, his third cup of coffee growing cold beside him. As a photo interpreter for the National Photographic Interpretation Center, he'd spent 5 years analyzing Soviet military installations, learning to distinguish T-62 tanks from T-55s by shadows and turret profiles alone. But something about this image from the latest Corona satellite pass troubled him. The Soviet air base near Ramenskoye showed exactly what Moscow wanted Washington to see. Rows of MiG-25 interceptors, their distinctive twin-tail profiles unmistakable even from 100 miles up. New hardened aircraft shelters, fresh runway extensions. Henderson had flagged it as a major strategic threat in his initial report, the kind of installation that could tip the nuclear balance. Then he noticed something odd. The shadows were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but subtly off in ways that made his trained eye pause. He pulled out his magnifying loupe and leaned closer. The concrete of the aircraft shelters seemed too uniform, lacking the weathering and textural variation of real construction. And that MiG-25 at the end of the third row, its shadow suggested it was lighter than it should be, almost as if it might blow away in a strong wind. Henderson picked up his red phone to call his supervisor. What he was about to report would reveal one of the Cold War's most elaborate and successful deception operations. The Soviets weren't just hiding their military capabilities from American spy satellites. They were actively fooling them with a massive program of fake cities, inflatable aircraft, and cardboard tanks, a high-tech twist on an ancient military art that would consume billions of rubles and fundamentally shape how both superpowers understood each other's strength. When President Dwight Eisenhower authorized the Corona spy satellite program in 1958, American intelligence officials believed they had achieved the ultimate advantage in the Cold War information war. For the first time in history, one nation could systematically photograph another's military installations from space, beyond the reach of air defenses. "We will know exactly what they have," CIA Director Allen Dulles confidently told the National Security Council in 1959. "There will be no more surprises. No more hidden buildups." The Soviets shared this assessment, with alarm. When Corona's first successful mission in August 1960 returned more photographs of Soviet territory than all previous U-2 flights combined, Khrushchev understood immediately that the strategic balance had shifted. "They can see everything," he told his military advisors during an emergency meeting at the Kremlin. "Every missile, every airfield, every submarine pen. We have lost our ability to surprise them." But Soviet military doctrine had an answer ready, rooted in centuries of Russian military deception stretching back to Potemkin's legendary fake villages. The concept was called Maskirovka, a comprehensive approach to military deception that encompassed camouflage, concealment, and deliberate misinformation. Where American intelligence saw satellites as providing perfect information, Soviet strategists saw an opportunity. If they controlled what the satellites photographed, they could shape American perceptions as surely as any propaganda broadcast. "The Americans believe their cameras cannot lie," observed Colonel Dmitry Savelyev of the GRU's Deception Directorate in a 1961 planning document declassified in 2003. "This makes them more vulnerable, not less. A man who trusts his eyes completely can be made to see whatever you wish him to see." The Americans, for their part, never doubted their satellite's accuracy. The technology seemed infallible. Corona's cameras could resolve objects as small as 5 feet across from 100 miles in space. By 1965, the more advanced KH-7 satellites could distinguish objects just 2 feet wide. The United States invested billions in these systems, analyzed thousands of images, and made strategic decisions based on what they showed. What neither side initially appreciated was how this would become a self-reinforcing cycle. Each advance in American reconnaissance would be met by increasingly sophisticated Soviet deception. Each Soviet deception breakthrough would justify greater American investment in satellite technology. The result would be a parallel arms race, not in weapons, but in the ability to see and to hide, to know and to deceive. Soviet Maskirovka doctrine had deep roots, but its application to satellite reconnaissance required systematic organization and massive resources. In late 1960, just months after Corona's first success, the Soviet General Staff established a dedicated department within the GRU, military intelligence, to coordinate strategic deception operations. The unit, designated as Directorate 12, reported directly to the Chief of the General Staff and received a classified budget that would eventually rival some weapons programs. The architect of the program was Colonel General Mikhail Kirian, a veteran of World War II deception operations who had helped create dummy tank armies that confused German reconnaissance before major Soviet offensives. In 1943, we used wood and canvas to fool German pilots, Kirian wrote in his classified 1965 manual on strategic deception. Now we use the same principles, but our enemy flies in space and never blinks. This makes our task both harder and easier. Harder because the detail must be perfect. Easier because the cameras cannot change their angle or investigate suspicious details. The Soviets began with systematic studies of American satellite orbits and photography capabilities. They quickly discovered that Corona and its successors followed predictable paths, passing over Soviet territory at regular intervals. We knew when they were watching, recalled Major Vladimir Cherkashin, who worked in satellite tracking from 1963 to 1971. Our astronomers could predict to the minute when an American satellite would photograph a given location. This gave us time to prepare. The deception program operated on multiple levels: real strategic installations, ICBM silos, submarine bases, nuclear weapons storage. Were camouflaged with sophisticated techniques: thermal insulation to reduce heat signatures, cable netting that mimicked natural terrain, and strict light discipline to prevent night photography. But concealment alone wasn't enough. Soviet doctrine emphasized that successful Maskirovka required showing the enemy what you wanted them to see, not just hiding what you had. This led to the construction of elaborate fakes. Beginning in 1962, the Soviet military began building dummy installations across the USSR. Fake air bases, missile silos, radar stations, and command centers. The most sophisticated ones were called Potemkin military bases by Western intelligence analysts who eventually discovered them, though this wouldn't happen for years. The first major facility was constructed outside Novosibirsk in 1962-63. From space, it appeared to be a strategic bomber base. Long runways, hardened shelters, fuel storage, barracks. Corona satellites photographed it religiously. CIA analysts counted aircraft, mostly Tu-95 Bears and M4 Bisons, based on their distinctive shapes and sizes. The installation was upgraded over time, showing increasing activity. In reality, the aircraft were remarkably sophisticated fakes. Some were actual aircraft fuselages, obsolete planes that had been stripped of engines and equipment, but left in realistic positions. Others were constructed from wood frames covered with painted canvas. The most advanced were inflatable, rubberized fabric stretched over frames that could be inflated with air compressors in hours, then deflated and moved. These inflatables, developed by a specialized factory in Leningrad, were remarkably realistic. They included proper shadows, simulated panel lines, and even fake heat signatures created by strategically placed heating elements. We spent 3 months perfecting the shadow of a MiG-21's tail, recalled engineer Boris Petrov, who worked at the inflatable plant. The Americans' cameras were very good. A shadow at the wrong angle would give us away. We tested everything. What materials reflected light like aluminum, how to simulate the slight sag of landing gear, even how frost would settle on a real aircraft versus a fake one in winter. The program expanded dramatically under Leonid Brezhnev. By 1965, the Soviet military operated an estimated 200 major deception sites across the USSR, supported by thousands of smaller dummy installations. The construction and maintenance employed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilian workers. Specialized military units, designated as Maskirovka battalions, were trained exclusively in deception operations. October 1967, the false arsenal. The most ambitious deception operation came to fruition in October 1967, as American anxiety about a potential Soviet first strike capability reached its peak. For 3 years, U.S. intelligence had been tracking what appeared to be a massive expansion of Soviet ICBM forces. New missile fields were appearing in Siberia and Central Asia at an alarming rate. Each Corona pass seemed to reveal more silos under construction. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara presented the evidence to President Johnson on October 12, 1967. Mr. President, our latest satellite reconnaissance shows 340 new ICBM silos in various stages of construction across the Soviet Union. This represents a 60% increase in their strategic forces in just 18 months. The missile gap we once feared may be opening, but in their favor. What McNamara didn't know was that he was describing the greatest Maskirovka triumph of the Cold War. Of those 340 new silos, approximately 220 were elaborate fakes, what the Soviets called maket raketny shakhta, dummy missile silos. The fake silos were engineering marvels of deception. Real ICBM silos required years to build, vast quantities of concrete and steel, and left unmistakable construction signatures. Excavation, heavy equipment, power lines, service roads, security facilities. The Soviets learned to replicate all of it at a fraction of the cost and time. Construction crews would excavate a shallow pit, perhaps 30 feet deep instead of the 180 feet required for a real silo. They'd pour a thin concrete cap that from directly overhead looked identical to the massive reinforced concrete doors of an actual silo. Around it, they'd construct realistic-looking support buildings from prefabricated panels, pump houses, guard stations, cable vaults. They'd string power lines, grade access roads, even position trucks and equipment at intervals timed to coincide with satellite passes. The most sophisticated touch was the construction sequence itself. Real silos took 18 to 24 months to build, going through distinct phases that Corona photographed regularly. Soviet deception teams created fake construction timelines that mimicked this progression. "We didn't just build a fake silo," explained Colonel Anatoly Klimov, who commanded a Maskirovka battalion during this period. "We showed the Americans what they expected to see: excavation in month 1, foundation work in months 3 through 6, structural installation through month 12, and final equipment by month 18. Each Corona pass showed realistic progress. The operation worked perfectly. U.S. intelligence analysts, watching the sites develop over many months through multiple satellite passes, had no reason to suspect deception. The construction sequences matched known Soviet practices. The sites showed appropriate security measures. Some even displayed what appeared to be missile erector vehicles during carefully timed satellite passes. Actual equipment temporarily moved to fake sites for photographic purposes. The strategic impact was enormous. Based on satellite intelligence showing this dramatic Soviet buildup, the Johnson administration accelerated America's own missile programs, added billions to defense budgets, and expanded ABM, anti-ballistic missile development. Hawks in Congress demanded even greater spending. "The Soviets are outbuilding us 3-to-1 in ICBMs," Senator Henry Jackson warned in November 1967, citing classified satellite reconnaissance. We cannot allow a missile gap to develop. But cracks were appearing in the deception. In December 1967, a CIA analyst named Margaret Thompson noticed something peculiar while reviewing thermal imagery from a new reconnaissance satellite. The fake silo sites showed none of the heat signatures associated with real missile facilities. No waste heat from environmental controls, no power generation, no personnel activity during Siberian winters when real bases would be fully occupied. Thompson's report triggered a comprehensive review. Over the next 6 months, intelligence analysts re-examined 3 years of satellite photography with new skepticism. They looked for subtle indicators. Did security patrols follow realistic patterns? Did snow removal around sites match the activity level of real bases? Were their communications antennas appropriate for the command and control requirements? By June 1968, U.S. intelligence had identified approximately 180 definitively fake installations. The discovery was both embarrassing and strategically significant. "We've been shadowboxing with cardboard," CIA Director Richard Helms told the National Security Council in a closed-door briefing. "The Soviets have been manipulating our intelligence assessments for years." But here's what made the revelation even more disturbing. Intelligence analysts couldn't confidently determine how many other sites were real versus fake. The Soviets had mixed genuine facilities with sophisticated deceptions, creating uncertainty that was itself strategically valuable. Even after the deception was exposed, American planners had to assume that any Soviet installation might be real, which still shaped U.S. force planning and budgets. The discovery of the fake silo network triggered dramatic changes on both sides of the intelligence war. For the Americans, it shattered confidence in satellite reconnaissance as an infallible source of truth. The intelligence community launched a massive program to develop new detection methods and analytical techniques. The National Reconnaissance Office, which managed U.S. spy satellites, accelerated development of multispectral imaging systems. These new satellites didn't just take photographs. They measured infrared signatures, radar reflections, and electromagnetic emissions. "We needed to look at Soviet installations in multiple ways simultaneously," explained John Pike, a defense analyst who later studied this period. A fake silo might look perfect in visible light, but show completely different characteristics in thermal or radar imaging. By 1970, the KH-9 hexagon satellite system combined high-resolution photography with signals intelligence capabilities, allowing analysts to correlate visual data with electronic emissions. Real missile sites generated characteristic electromagnetic signatures, communications, power systems, guidance radars. Fakes were electronically silent. The Defense Intelligence Agency established new protocols for validating satellite intelligence. Analysts now looked for what they called indicators of actual military utility, patterns that suggested real operations rather than show. Did personnel arrive and depart in ways consistent with shift changes? Was there periodic maintenance activity? Did supply convoys follow realistic schedules? The Soviets, aware their deception had been partially compromised, adapted with characteristic thoroughness. The Maskirovka program didn't shrink. It evolved and expanded. By 1972, Soviet deception battalions had grown to brigade strength, with specialized units for different types of installations. The new generation of Soviet fakes incorporated active measures to defeat multispectral reconnaissance. Dummy missile sites now included heating elements that simulated thermal signatures of real facilities. They installed electronic equipment that generated radio and radar emissions matching actual military installations. Some fake air bases even created realistic electromagnetic profiles by operating actual radar and communications equipment without any real aircraft present. We studied American detection methods as carefully as they studied our deception, recalled General Vladimir Lobov, who oversaw Maskirovka operations in the 1970s. When they added thermal imaging, we added heating systems. When they began analyzing electromagnetic signatures, we installed transmitters. It was a competition where both sides grew more sophisticated each year. The Soviets also pioneered what became known as adaptive deception, fake installations that could be rapidly converted to real ones, or vice versa. Some sites maintained both fake and real equipment, showing the fakes during satellite passes while hiding real capabilities underground or in hardened shelters. This created profound uncertainty for American intelligence. Even sites identified as probably fake couldn't be dismissed from strategic calculations. Soviet investment in inflatable decoys reached industrial scale. The specialized factories in Leningrad and Sverdlovsk produced thousands of units annually. Inflatable tanks, aircraft, missiles, even entire buildings. These weren't crude approximations, but sophisticated replicas incorporating proper materials, realistic details, and even simulated electronic signatures. An inflatable T-72 tank cost approximately 3,000 rubles, noted a 1979 Soviet military logistics report. A real T-72 cost 180,000 rubles. For the price of one real tank, we could create 60 decoys that were indistinguishable from satellite reconnaissance. The cost-benefit analysis was obvious. Third parties became increasingly involved in this deception warfare. Soviet allies received Maskirovka training and equipment. Warsaw Pact countries established their own deception programs, following Soviet doctrine. Some of the most elaborate fake installations appeared in East Germany and Czechoslovakia, positioned to threaten NATO forces while concealing the actual disposition of Soviet troops. The program even extended to Soviet client states. In the 1970s, Cuba, Syria, Vietnam, and Libya all received Soviet Maskirovka advisors and equipment. Cuban fake missile sites during the 1980s caused periodic diplomatic incidents when U.S. reconnaissance satellites detected what appeared to be new Soviet deployments, which turned out to be elaborate deceptions managed by Soviet-trained Cuban forces. The psychological dimension became increasingly important. Soviet planners realized that even exposed deceptions retained strategic value by creating uncertainty and forcing American analysts to question every piece of intelligence. If they cannot trust their satellites, they cannot trust their assessments, noted a 1975 GRU planning document. Doubt is as valuable as deception. November 1983. Able Archer and the Ultimate Deception Problem. The Soviet Maskirovka program reached its operational peak during the Able Archer 83 crisis, when the intersection of deception, counter-deception, and genuine nuclear tensions brought the world closer to accidental war than most realized at the time. By 1983, Soviet strategic deception had become so sophisticated and comprehensive that it created a dangerous paradox. American intelligence could no longer confidently distinguish between real Soviet military preparations and elaborate fakes designed to test Western responses. This uncertainty proved nearly catastrophic during NATO's Able Archer command post exercise in November 1983. The exercise simulated NATO procedures for escalating to nuclear war. Soviet intelligence, watching through their own reconnaissance satellites and human sources, detected unusual activity that matched their worst fears about an American first strike. Encrypted communication surges, command centers going to higher alert status, military movements across Western Europe. But here's the terrifying irony. The Soviets couldn't be certain whether this was a real alert disguised as an exercise or actually just an exercise. Years of running their own deceptions had made them hypersensitive to the possibility that NATO might use the same tactics. We had taught ourselves to see deception everywhere, recalled General Viktor Starodubov, who was on duty at Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces headquarters during the crisis. We had created such elaborate fakes for so long that we began to suspect the Americans were doing the same thing, that their exercise was actually preparation for real attack, masked as routine operations. Soviet forces moved to unprecedented readiness levels. Nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland were placed on alert with live weapons. SS-20 missile units received preliminary launch authorization. Most alarmingly, some Soviet commanders began implementing Maskirovka procedures themselves, ordering fake alert activities designed to confuse American reconnaissance while hiding real preparations. The crisis passed when Able Archer concluded on November 11, 1983. But declassified documents later revealed how close the situation had come to catastrophic misunderstanding. Both sides were engaged in such elaborate deception operations that we almost deceived ourselves into nuclear war. One CIA analyst concluded in a 1984 post-mortem report that remained classified until 2015. By the mid-1980s, the scale of Soviet Maskirovka was staggering. U.S. intelligence estimated that the USSR maintained over 1,500 significant deception sites, employed approximately 80,000 personnel in dedicated deception units, and spent roughly 2 to 3 billion rubles annually on the program, equivalent to about 3% of the entire Soviet defense budget. The specialized factories produced not just inflatable equipment, but also sophisticated electronic deception systems, thermal decoys, and even chemical treatments that mimic the appearance of real military materials to various sensors. The quality reached remarkable levels. American analysts examining high-resolution imagery from the new KH-11 reconnaissance satellites, which returned digital images in near real time, found that Soviet decoys now included such details as realistic weathering, simulated maintenance activity, and even fake problems like deliberately staged equipment malfunctions that made sites look more authentic. Some of the most sophisticated deceptions involved submarine construction. At certain Soviet shipyards, the construction of ballistic missile submarines occurred simultaneously with the construction of elaborate fake submarines in adjacent berths. From satellite imagery, analysts couldn't always determine which submarine was real. The fakes were actual hulls, stripped of all internal systems, but externally identical to real submarines. They would be launched with appropriate ceremony, then towed to bases where they served as permanent decoys. The ultimate vindication of the program came from an unexpected source: analysis of Soviet military budgets after the Cold War ended. Western economists had struggled for decades to estimate Soviet defense spending based on observed military capabilities. Their estimates were consistently high, suggesting the USSR was spending 15 to 20% of GDP on defense. When Soviet archives opened in the 1990s, the actual figure was closer to 11 to 13%. Much of the military capability Western analysts had observed and factored into their estimates was elaborate deception, creating the illusion of greater strength than actually existed. They succeeded brilliantly at the ultimate goal of Maskirovka, admitted retired Air Force General John Chain in a 1996 interview. They convinced us they were stronger than they really were, forcing us to spend billions countering capabilities that didn't exist. From a cost-benefit perspective, every ruble spent on deception generated $10 in unnecessary American defense spending. The fall of the Soviet Union revealed the full scope of the Maskirovka program through opened archives and interviews with former practitioners. The revelations reshaped understanding of Cold War intelligence warfare and continue to influence military deception doctrine today. Post-Soviet Russia inherited and modernized the program. During the 2008 Georgia War and the 2014 Ukraine conflict, Russian forces deployed sophisticated inflatable decoys and electronic deception systems developed from Soviet-era technology. Modern Maskirovka now incorporates cyber warfare and information operations. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Control what your adversary sees, and you control what they believe. The broader implications extended beyond military deception. The Soviet program demonstrated that expensive, technologically advanced intelligence systems could be systematically fooled by determined adversaries willing to invest in comprehensive deception. This lesson proved relevant in the age of commercial satellites and open-source intelligence. More sensors don't necessarily mean more truth. The American response evolved into sophisticated patterns of life analysis, using multiple intelligence sources over extended periods to detect anomalies that might indicate deception. Modern U.S. intelligence doctrine emphasizes verification through multiple independent means, rather than reliance on any single collection method, no matter how advanced. Perhaps most significantly, Soviet Maskirovka succeeded at its ultimate strategic objective. It contributed to the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War by convincing American leaders that the USSR was more powerful than it actually was. This perception discouraged aggressive policies, while Soviet economic weakness gradually became undeniable. In this light, the cardboard tanks and inflatable aircraft represented not just tactical deception, but strategic communication, a way for a weakening superpower to maintain deterrence without triggering the very confrontation it sought to avoid. As Robert Henderson, the CIA analyst who first detected the deception in 1967, reflected years later, "We thought we were looking at their military with perfect clarity from space. Instead, we were watching the greatest magic show in military history. And the really remarkable thing? Even after we figured out the trick, we still couldn't afford to ignore what we were seeing. That's the genius of Maskirovka. Even obvious deception retains power." The fake cities and cardboard tanks vanished with the Soviet Union. But their legacy persists in Russian military doctrine, in American intelligence procedures, and in the fundamental understanding that, in the age of satellites and sensors, the art of deception remains as relevant as ever. The Cold War proved that seeing is not always believing, and in a nuclear standoff, that uncertainty might have saved the world.